Atheism functions as a placebo for people dealing with religious trauma, just like theism. Prove me wrong. This is the comment that we're going to be replying to for today's comment deep dive. I have a real pet peeve with people getting atheism incorrect because it's just so simple. You say you believe in a God and that I should too. I say, well, I don't. That's it. It's not a worldview. We're not a club. We don't have a president or a pope. It is just a ridiculous thing that typically comes from believers who are mislabeling what the atheist is to make their position or their argument stronger. Now, the thing that struck me as odd in this particular comment, and I think it's the only comment I've ever gotten from this person, is that he says just like theism. So it could be a Christian who is just saying, well, theism is a cope and atheism a cope. It could be someone who's agnostic who's making this, but that would be more rare. It actually doesn't matter what their background is. I'm going to take them up on their challenge. They said, prove them wrong. And I'm just nerdy enough to tackle this in as much detail as you're about to get. I'll try not to spend too much time explaining to this commenter that they are the one who made the claim. They should be proving that to me. It is not my burden of proof to show you that your assertion, because you didn't provide any thinking or argumentation for this, isn't valid, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. But following that same track, what someone who actually is trying to make this case would have to establish with evidence is that atheism is primarily adopted for emotional relief. You're going to have an uphill battle with that one. That it functions via false belief and false comfort. Again, sounds like you may not know the actual definition of atheism. And you would have to prove that it doesn't correspond to reality. So in a way, this is absolutely a claim for theism, because atheism can only be a placebo, which is a false belief that leads to comfort, if theism is true. So that's a whole lot of things that you would need to prove first before I should deal with this. But again, we're going to go ahead and get into it. Let's talk about the word placebo. A placebo is an inert treatment that produces sometimes a real benefit and sometimes a perceived benefit via the belief in its effectiveness. Also, what that means is it doesn't actually address the underlying cause. Like if someone is sick and they take a sugar pill, a placebo, and they feel better, that didn't actually cure them of whatever the underlying illness was. It may have relieved their symptoms temporarily, but again, it's not getting to that underlying reality. So it quite literally works because of false belief, which is already the first thing that we could prove this wrong with. Atheism is a lack of belief. Saying that atheism works as a placebo when a placebo requires more false belief that the atheist is leaving behind, it's nonsensical. So hold all of that in this hand, and over here, we're going to look at the definition of atheism. The absence of belief in a god or in gods. It's if you want to extend some positive force to it, a philosophical position about metaphysical claims. It's not a therapy, it's not a religion, it's not a belief system. So already you should see quite the category error. A placebo is a psychological intervention, and atheism is a non-belief position about a truth claim. And I can hear many of you saying, yeah, it's so simple. This guy's an idiot. Why are you taking the time to reply? And I think it's interesting because he used the word placebo, but effectively, he's just saying that it's a cope, right? People don't want to deal with having to live up to God's standards, or they don't want to feel bad about their sin. Maybe they're too lazy to actually live like Christ, or they're afraid of hell, and so they just, choose atheism to magically feel better about all of that. I mean, the one simple thing I could say here, and I made an entire video on it, so go check it out, is around that whole idea of atheists become atheists because they just want to sin. If we're talking about a placebo, we're talking about something that's going to bring me comfort. Only within staying in the religion and sinning do you get the get out of jail free card and the promise of paradise. Choosing, as if that's what happens, to become an atheist, to avoid the consequences of sin, is again a nonsensical position. Atheists don't believe in hell or sin. And if they did, by the way, which would just about mean they're not an atheist, it would be as stupid as saying, I choose not to believe in cops so I can commit crime. Like, It's almost hard for me to understand how he got this sentence written down without laughing. What if I told you not believing in ghosts is actually just a placebo from your trauma of watching scary movies too early in life? What? Refusing to affirm a claim is not a treatment. So we kind of beat that point up, but let's move on to the false equivalence that is here. He says, just like theism. And again, depending on his background, and I wish he had said more, I don't want to make too many assumptions, but even comparing atheism and theism, both working in some way, it's very problematic, especially for this particular claim about comfort or a placebo, because theism does explicitly make claims about comfort. In many forms of theism, you are told that you are loved unconditionally, that your suffering has a purpose, that the God of all creation has a plan for you, that you will get to be reunited with your loved ones, that really there is no death, that justice will ultimately prevail, and that you are cosmically significant. Those are emotionally regulating promises. Atheism makes none of those. So if someone was trying to use atheism as a placebo, they're really barking up the wrong tree. In fact, atheism actually removes a lot of those. If you don't believe, and we'll just use Christianity as the example here, obviously you can be an atheist at large or to multiple religions or whatever. But speaking about Christianity here, if I don't believe in Christianity, I lose the concept of eternal reward. I lose the guarantee of cosmic purpose. I lose the sense of ultimate justice and a billion other things, little things even. They don't seem so little to some people sometimes, but like divine protection. That's the opposite of a placebo. That's signing up for reality, and reality kind of sucking in comparison to the false promises of the thing you no longer believe in. If anything, becoming an atheist removes comforting illusion from your life. But let's get a little bit clinical here. What was the actual term that you used? A placebo for people dealing with religious trauma. Okay. I believe religious trauma is real, or religious trauma syndrome. RTS is how we typically refer to it. And it's not formally in the DSM yet. I imagine someday it will be, but it's still heavily studied and treated via psychological literature. So here's a quick list of some things that someone might deal with because of their RTS. And this part's even hard too, because RTS can be still had by believers as well as people that have left that belief, or people in between, and especially actually people in between, people that have started to doubt. They see the issues, they're going through deconstruction, they're facing the hard verses, they're facing the hard truth, but maybe they still believe, maybe they're still hanging on to something. And so you see things like anxiety, hypervigilance, fear of hell, shame conditioning, authoritarian conditioning, identity fragmentation, cognitive distortions, an inability to trust yourself or your judgment. That's all real religious trauma and a billion other things. And what do we know? What have we learned about how people actually heal from trauma? Practices like cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive restructuring, exposure to reality testing. I'd like to do a video on this where we can get into each of these and explain them and show how they help and how they work and where you can get help like this. I think that's an important episode to do at some point. Because if you are someone that is suffering with any of those things I listed, there's a lot of different ways to feel better, to get better. None of which, by the way, would be the placebo of atheism. So where atheism does play a role, where some people do feel relief, which just because someone feels relief doesn't mean it's a cope or a placebo, is because they've actually looked at the claims, found that they no longer believed it, and thus were free of the fear they had of it. The perfect example is hell. It's a removal of that threat source. When you don't consider the Bible to be the end-all be-all guide about reality, then the claims that were made in the Bible about reality that used to cause you any kind of suffering or trauma, they don't affect you anymore once you actually let go. But you're not actually letting go, pretending to let go, which again would be the placebo or the cope part. You just simply let go. You weren't convinced anymore. Your belief changed. It left. That's exposure therapy, essentially, which is like the opposite of a placebo. Not quite the opposite, but you get it. They're not the same. If someone stops fearing eternal torment after concluding that there's no evidence for it, that's not symptom masking. like a placebo. It's belief correction, which is the other thing that's kind of insinuated here, that people don't have the right to update their beliefs, or if they do, what that says about them. In fact, I did this video on it. Can't we all just grow up a little bit? You want to believe in your God, fine. You want to make arguments for your God, fine. But how on earth do we continue to hear all of these ridiculous talking points? And as long as Christians keep making them, I don't care about the term low-hanging fruit anymore. Low-hanging fruit is available to everybody. It is what is most commonly picked. It's also sometimes the most poisonous. So I'm not going to sit around on my high horse to feel philosophically profound and say, I'm only going to deal with the top tier arguments. Sorry to break it to you, there's not a lot of top tier arguments that the invisible man in the sky who wants to burn people who don't agree with him or worship him or love him or obey him or believe in him based off his horrific evidence or lack thereof is the most real and the most important truth in the universe. Sorry, it's all low-hanging fruit when what it's arguing for simply doesn't exist. Back to the logical side of things. And again, hey, sorry if I'm going on here, but you said prove you wrong. So there's a lot of ways to show how wrong that statement was. It's psychologically inverted. I mean, we see, again, almost the exact opposite here. From data, not opinion, not anecdote. Here's the props for you believers that want this from the data. A religious belief correlates with people who have lower death anxiety. Of course it does. First of all, that doesn't mean that it's true just because it provides relief. If anything, it shows that it has the potential to be the placebo here. But of course it does. It's saying you won't die, you'll live forever. And not only that, it's going to be awesome and perfect, and you'll get to be with the people you want and do the things you want to do. It's unattractive belief, one that some people might go ahead and just try to do for the sake of it. Where have I heard that before? Oh, Pascal's wager. That's why it's so funny that an atheist or atheism is what is attacked for believing things just to get a better result. That's like one of the big arguments for Christianity. Religious belief has also shown to increase people's feeling about their perceived meaning. Religious belief increases comfort about injustice. Now, I'm not saying everyone who believes is choosing to falsely believe for the sake of comfort, but I think that if we were going to err on one side about which group actually does this, it would absolutely be those who believe in the religion. Do you know how many people I've talked to over the last almost 3 years of doing this, that once they saw the issues, they did admit to putting their head in the sand and choosing to just go with the flow because it was too hard to follow reality? That's a placebo. That's a cope. On the other hand, you have atheist, where the data shows that on average, they have a higher acceptance of mortality. That also makes sense. If you don't believe in an afterlife, you've got to come to terms at some point with the fact that this is all you get. There's a much lower belief in cosmic justice. Of course, you still have atheists who will say things like there's no such thing as coincidence, or what goes around comes around, some belief in karma, that they can still persuade themselves that it's all going to work out in the end and everyone's getting what they're supposed to. But by and large, I think most people who have left the belief in a religion that promised those kinds of things leave it at the door. Atheists, by data, have greater existential uncertainty, obviously, and it's also shown that they have a higher tolerance for ambiguity. So if someone wanted pure comfort from these two camps, which one do you think they would choose? Atheism removes all those wonderful eternal guarantees, and it increases existential responsibility. Oh my gosh, I'm responsible for my meaning. I'm responsible for figuring out what I believe about morality. I'm responsible for still living a life that is beneficial to myself and others without the dangling hope of paradise or the stick of hell. Now, I will get a bit anecdotal, but I know that this is true for so many people that leave any religion. Most of the time, people who leave a religion were involved in that religion. That means that was their source of community. That means that was their source of comfort. It means that's probably what the closest people in their life believe, like their friends and family or spouses or kids or parents. I had life on easy mode when I was a believer. But the assumption here is that because maybe in the back recesses of my mind, hell was a concern, even if it wasn't for me selfishly, I was saved, but other people would have to burn and suffer. You think the wisest thing I could do is blow up my life, become the black sheep of my community, actually risk my eternal soul, create division with anyone I've ever known so that I can, what, under your mind, pretend I don't believe in hell when I do? Too many atheists have gone through too much discomfort for standing up for what they actually believe is true and untrue, to have this baseless assertion thrown at them of cope or placebo. But in case I haven't proved you wrong yet, I think sometimes comparisons or analogies can go a long way. Imagine that someone leaves a cult, a really stupid cult with lots of really stupid beliefs. They were raised to believe that the moon is made of cheese, and that if you doubt the moon is made of cheese, you'll be punished forever, and also that the cheese moon loves you and has a plan for you. Now, this person stops believing that the moon is made of cheese. Are they taking a placebo, or are they correcting a belief? Sometimes you have to leave the religion you believe in and make a silly example so you can see how silly it actually is. Now, that same person who left the cult, their fear has subsided a bit, or maybe even entirely, about being punished forever. So why did it subside? Well, it's simple. The threat is now gone, not because a new comforting illusion was adopted. So again, removing a false belief is not a placebo. It's reality. And I got to tell you, reality makes for a pretty shitty placebo. Now, again, I don't know this person's personal stance, but the last thing that I'll say, the thing that is becoming more and more obvious to me every single day, is how much projection goes into your typical comment against me online, or against atheist, or in favor of Christianity. And it's sad because many people are taught that atheists just want to sin, or atheists are just hurt, or atheists are just reacting emotionally, or atheists are all trying to avoid accountability. By the way, I mean, I've talked about all of these. The amount of accountability in my life has skyrocketed since leaving the faith. But again, I know all of that are sound bites that are constantly put out there by believers. And so when you see someone leave religion, you can say, oh yeah, no, it's a cope. But it's projection. You're doing that, and they're saying that because it protects their worldview. I saw firsthand, again, I'll just speak from my own personal experience, friends that had been doubting right alongside me, that had a lot of the same questions and issues I had. When I went all the way, when I faced reality head on, and when I finally arrived at the conclusion that was forced upon me, what we had believed simply wasn't true, I saw them peel back. And all of a sudden, these people that had seemed to show some of that same intellectual humility and curiosity and honesty were the ones saying these same things to me. Wait, what, you don't believe? Aren't you scared about hell? What about your wife? Listen, I know church isn't always perfect, but that doesn't say anything about God. You're just being emotional. You're just reacting incorrectly here to the perceived suffering that you have the wrong blame for. And I couldn't believe it. I was so let down, but I could understand it to a degree, because if they accepted the reality of the situation that someone like myself, who they knew really believed, that was the other thing, even some of my closest friends, you must have not really ever believed then, Brandon. Was it all a facade? These are things they had to say. They had to think like placebos to maintain their faith. Because again, if they admitted the reality of the situation, that I really was a believer, that I really did dedicate 3 decades to this God, that I really believed I had a relationship with him, and that I heard from him and the Holy Spirit. If someone like me, who was really all those things, could lose my faith, could even find that it's not true, so could they. But if I become the other, if I get notched down a bit as emotional or hurt or seeking comfort or reactionary, then they can pin that sin upon my chest and move on with their day. If atheism is a rational conclusion based off evidence and or lack of evidence, then leaving religion might be justified. But believers can't have leaving religion be justified, so they can't accept that reality, and so they lie. And unfortunately, somehow even worse, I think many of them don't know that they're lying. Thus, the cope. Thus, the placebo, willful blindness. Calling something a placebo like this is just a way for you to avoid actually engaging. I've probably known this all along, but I see it so much more clearly the more that I learn. Every one of these stupid comments that gets in front of me from some true believer that has the peace and love and light and truth and justice of God Almighty is just typing their little comment for protection. And in that way, I can almost empathize with them. You're doing what you have to for your comfort. But in the midst of that, don't turn around and project onto me the very thing you're obviously doing that I'm obviously not. End of story. Here it is. A placebo comforts you with something that isn't real. Atheism removes something that hasn't been shown to be real. Those are not the same. I want to specially call out Gnarlywill, someone who has made the biggest pledge that you can, that I have unfortunately left off of this list for too long now. But also, of course, those who have been supporting for a long time, and Boris, Chris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn. Then our Humanist heroes, Chris, Craig, James, Jarrod, Kristi. Our Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jeremy, Jugs, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas. As well as all of my secular scholar patrons.